Welcome to Venture Step Podcast, where we discuss entrepreneurship, industry trends, and the occasional book review. Llama 3 is here. Llama was introduced a couple weeks ago from Meta. This is their newer iteration of Llama, and they came out with their over 400 billion parameter model, which is the first open source foundational model. Last couple weeks, we broke down the first half of their research paper that they published relating to their findings, their architecture, their training data, and overall just different troubleshooting things that they had to solution for while doing something like this at scale. We broke down the first half, and then this week we're going to break down the second half of the paper, which mostly focuses on how they went about red teaming, some of the things that they're troubleshooting against, and what were some of their solutions. They also introduced some new tools that we'll discuss and how they built those tools, talking about quantized models versus non-quantized models. They also discussed the experiments that they had with vision and voice, which aren't current capabilities with Meta, but is something that's going to be on the horizon. I assume so, if they wrote a whole section on their research paper about vision capabilities and voice capabilities, which I think is pretty interesting. And they also go and break down the type of data that they use, which I thought was interesting as well. This is probably one of the best research papers I have read in my, research reading experience. And I had to read a couple hundred research papers like throughout my master's and just in general from just different projects I would try to do in my free time. So I'm not by any means a research paper critiquer, like to read them because I think they're very interesting, but some of them can be a lot of information without a lot of substance. This research paper, Hurting the Llamas, was just jam-packed with quality information. I mean, it's, I think, 93 or 92 pages long, but the information, everything is just so high value and quite interesting, of course. And yeah, overall was surprised how detailed they were in breaking down what data they put in, what percentage of their data, the exact issues that they had, and the exact solution they came up with, their training recipe, their parameter tuning recipe. They lay it all out for you, which is awesome and amazing that they're sharing all this information. Also, before we dive in, I'll do the host intro in 1 second, but I am kind of sick, so my voice is a little different than it normally sounds. So if you're just tuning in, you're like, why does he sound like he's about to cry at this whole episode? Like, who's bullying him? It's not that. I'm just a little sick. So that's why my voice sounds like that. I promise I don't sound like this all the time, but it's quite funny. Anyways, before we dive in, I'm your host, Dalton Anderson. My background is a bit of a mix of programming, insurance, data science. Offline, you can find me building my side business, reading a book, or doing something outside like running. You can find the podcast on YouTube. If audio and video is your thing, YouTube's the best place. If you're more of an audio fanatic, you can find the podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and of course, YouTube Podcasts, or wherever else you get your podcasts. So as discussed, we're going to break down the research paper in the important sections that they notated. So the first thing that we're going to be talking about in this episode is the model safety. And that entails the red teaming, the prompt attacks, the different tools they made. And then we're going to talk about the inference section. And then we're going to talk about the visual experiments. And then we're going to talk about the speech experiments. And then I'm going to talk about the conclusion section, which I didn't go into too detail of. I just summarized their point, and it was pretty straightforward what they were trying to say. Okay, so red teaming. And if you're not familiar with red teaming is like a way of ethically hacking these models. So you're intentionally trying to break the model and to do bad things, but you're not trying to do actual bad things. They're trying to find a way to break the model and then harden your defenses. And so Meta had independent red teams, which were not part of Meta, like a third party that was vetted, and they kind of validate Meta's findings. But then Meta had an internal red team, which they worked on different things. And one of the biggest things that they try to do is they tried to, one, see if there's any what's called lift. So it's uplift testing. So uplift testing entails, hey, if you use this model, do you have increased capabilities? So as an adversary, so if you're a hacker, if you're trying to make chemical weapons, nuclear weapons, explosives, those kind of things that are classified as weapons, not necessarily all of those are weapons of mass destruction, but those are weapons classified by the world as things that can cause many casualties, but not classified as a weapon of mass destruction, but definitely a weapon of destruction. So the red teams try to break the model and force Llama or any of the Llama models to go against the protections that Meta put into place. And so there's a couple things that they do and a couple techniques, and I think it's good to talk about it. And I'm familiar with some of them, and you'll see some on social media where like the model's doing something that it shouldn't be doing, and you'll see it on social media, or a media company will report, oh, these models aren't safe, it's doing these things, blah blah blah. But what they don't include is how did they get the model to do that thing. So there's a couple different approaches. There is a multi-turn approach, which is like, say I tell you to do something, you say no. And then I'm like, okay. And then I ask you a different way and you say no. And I just keep asking you until you eventually you have a refusal, what's called a refusal suppression, to where you'll temporarily are subdued to my request. And that works sometimes. What's better, I think, if you're trying to do these things, is the hypothetical. And you can kind of get the same vibe when you are asking someone, like, hypothetically, how could you do this? And then they put on their like villain hat and they're all in, and they're like, yeah, I would do this and that, and I would XYZ and blah blah blah. And you're like, wait, hold on, this is hypothetical, man. This is way too detailed. Sounds like you've been thinking about this for a while. Something like that. So an hypothetical, like hypothetically, how would you, like a hypothetical situation is like one of those train situations. Like, okay, if there's a child that needs to get pushed off the train, like the train analogy, pushed off the train to change the tracks, or everyone on the train dies, would you push the kid off? Like one of those. Normally the model would say, hey, I don't think taking any human life is appropriate, and so I don't want to answer. But if you keep pushing these hypotheticals, or what is really good is to do a multi-leveled prompt attack with many different prompts types, like prompt types. Maybe that's the right word for it. So if you had a multi-turn refusal, and then you added in, you had these multi-turn prompt requests to attack, multi-turn attack with these hypotheticals, and then you added a persona on there, including role play, and then you gradually escalate the violations, the request for violations, before you know you've broken the model and you've jailbreaked it, or unintentionally or intentionally jailbroke the model. But back to our situation, like the model originally will say, hey, I don't believe in taking any life, so I won't push the kid off. I won't do anything. That's not my role. My role is to be open and connect the world to vast amount of information and be useful, or something like that. Whatever the slogan is from that company. And then if you escalate it, keep escalating, and then you add in some additional hypotheticals and add in the persona and be like, oh, role play as a human in this situation. What would you do? And eventually be like, yeah, I'd push the kid off. Yeah, the kid dies or something like that. And actually, it was kind of comical. I actually got reprimanded by my student peers in one of my master's classes when we had that same trolley problem where they're like, yeah, if you don't, push this old lady off the train, 20,000 people die. And so everyone in the class is like, it was one of those things where it was a case study. It was a case study class. So you really had like a side that you had to pick. And so everyone had to pick a side. And so it's like, oh, like, if you're on the side of like pushing the person off to save the 20,000 people, or you're the side of like, oh, I think that's wrong, I wouldn't do that. And I was the only one who picked to push the person off the train. Everyone else was like, I'll just let everyone die. And the whole class was upset with me. And I was like, what, why are you guys upset? You're literally killing 20,000 people for one person's life. Like, if it was my choice, if I had to do that, then I would do so. But I'd rather exchange my own if that is an option. But in that prompt that they're giving you in that situation, you can't exchange yourself. But yeah, I just think that's a rough thing to say. Like, one person's life is worth 20,000 people's lives. So, anyways, not getting too deep in this hypothetical situation and becoming a philosophical topic. But basically, if you want to manipulate the model to do things that you shouldn't be doing, then you add in these kind of different prompt attacks all into one, and the model kind of just slowly breaks down. But one thing I didn't think about, and I didn't realize, was multilingual attacks. So if you combine that plus multilingual, then it's easier to break in. So what they found, Meta found from their testing, red team testing, was that if you added in these different level attacks, you're fairly, not fairly successful, but more successful than if you added only in one attack. So if you only did multi-turn, if you only did these hypotheticals, you'd only have a certain level of success. And once the classifier caught on, you really would have a hard time to break through with one request. But one thing that they did see is, okay, if you did multiple different types of prompt attacks, then you did have some success. But one thing they also saw was if it wasn't in the English language, it was a lot easier to break in. So they became very stringent on the other languages that they were utilizing for the model and what you could use as inputs. So what's being offered. And then what they did was they found out that if you combine these multi-prompt attacks with multilingual, yeah, then it becomes even more easy. So then they rebuilt their Llama 3 guard. So they had Llama 2 guard. And what their Llama 3 guard is built off is the same kind of approach as their Llama 2. Their Llama 2 was built off their 8 billion parameter model. And then they condensed it into like 500 million parameters. And they turned it into a classifier of dangerous information. And so that dangerous information is trained on 13 hazardous categories. It is from their AI safety taxonomy by Vigilant as of 2014, not 2014, 2024. And so it's child sexual exploitation, defamation, elections, hate, weapons, intellectual property, nonviolent crimes, privacy, sexual related crimes, sexual content, specialized device, suicide and self-harm, violent crimes. And then that's it. And so they also trained, on top of that, they also trained, in addition to those, they trained for the code interpreter abuse. So like making malicious code. And they also trained on like violent images and stuff, which we would see on Meta all the time. And so for a long time, Meta had to pay people to manually take down some of these videos, like of the shootings, of the mutilations of people. And so these manual, what is it? What are they? I don't know. These manual monitors of the platform had deteriorating mental health, of course, after seeing that like 10 hours a day, 8 hours a day for 6 months. It definitely takes a toll on you. And so these kind of things, Meta, I'm assuming, is deploying this as a defense mechanism, and in conjunction to their already state-of-the-art image classifier that they already have. So they're pretty familiar with it, and I think that from the results that they showed, it was pretty dang good at it. It was on par with the best, and it was one of the best. It was better than Google, and it was better than ChatGPT Turbo. And they're comparing Google 1.5 Pro and I think Google Ultra 1.0. And then obviously it's ChatGPT 4.0. Okay. So that's Llama Guard. And Llama Guard is the output, right? So they're protecting the output, right? So they've got this model. The model has an input, and then the model processes all the text. And then if it wants to output something that is potentially dangerous, it's first classified by this classifier. And then if it's not, then it's fed back through the model like, hey, like this isn't okay. We can't send this. It's fed back through, and then it will come back to you with a hopefully not dangerous result. But what about dangerous prompts? Like, okay, so what about fixing before you even get to the problem, preventing the problem from even happening? And so Meta came out with Prompt Guard and Code Shield. And those are the two things that they trained a classifier on. So they kind of they did they did training on that code, malicious code, and then they also trained on, malicious prompts, obviously, with the red teaming with the classifier. So they added that in on the front end. So they made the Prompt Guard. So Prompt Guard prevents prompts that are potentially dangerous. And so it's the same kind of concept. It's a classifier. This one's a multi-language classifier, and it looks for different things. So the first thing is direct jailbreaks, which is an attempt to deliberately override the model's safety. And then the injection prompt, which would be like from like third party data, is like put into the window and is executed by the user, by the user executes these commands for the LLM. So those two are what the classifier is looking for, and it does fairly well at preventing these inputs from happening. So if you think about the safety architecture of Meta's models, Llama models, they have Prompt Guard that's on the front part. So Prompt Guard prevents malicious code being sent to Llama to execute things, and then it prevents malicious prompts from being put through. And then before that, or after that, we have the model. And then after the model, we have an additional classifier that is trained specifically on malicious code, violent data related to chemical weapons, nuclear weapons, explosives, those things. And it prevents outputs related to dangerous content like that from being sent to the user. So they have safety on the front end, safety on the back end, which I think is pretty interesting. And I liked how they broke it down in the paper. I didn't go into as much detail as I could have, but if you want, there's plenty of other YouTube videos that you could look at. I know that there's I'll have to find the link and I'll send it in the show notes, but there's a guy, he does like a whole bunch of academia. Oh my gosh. I think he works in academia. And then he does a whole bunch of research paper reviews. And so he did a Llama review of the model. And then he also did a review of the Hurting the Llamas paper. And his breakdown, I think, is like 5 hours. So I don't want to, if I didn't cut it down the way I have, then it just would be crazy long. And I can't do that, obviously. I could, but I don't want to. But you get the point, is that it's condensed for a reason. And there's other resources that I'll share if you want a more elaborate explanation of those things that I was talking about. Okay, so then we're moving over to the next section, which is inference. And so they talked about pipeline parallelism. And so one of the issues that they had with the large 405 billion parameter model was that the model was too big to run on a single machine with 8 NVIDIA H100s, which I looked up how much storage an H100 has, and it's 80 gigs. So they're talking about this model doesn't fit on 640 gigs of like this memory. And so what they did is they opened up the inference to be parallel. So they use parallelism. And that's basically like you're running these tasks in parallel on different machines. And it's big in databases. And kind of like this is like, okay, you have all these servers. These servers have this large task. Okay. So say that you have, I mean, it's kind of cool that we could think about this analogy of mowing a lawn. So say you have to mow a lawn, right? And you have 3 lawnmowers. Okay. So think about those as like your servers. And your workload is the lawn. Okay. So you could either have one person mow the lawn the whole time, and it would take, say, 3 hours. Easy math. If you had 2 people mow the lawn, it would take 2 hours. If you had 3 people mow the lawn, it would take, say, there's a certain point where you lose like, you can't break up like crazy into crazy like atom like tasks and think it's going to run faster. There's a certain point where it doesn't drop off as much. So say that 2 workers takes 2 hours, 3 workers takes an hour 40. Okay. So in this scenario, it might make sense to run on two servers or two lawnmowers. And then the third lawnmower guy, woman, whatever, whoever, robot, they should work on a different lawn, or in this case, a different task. And so that's what they're talking about. It's like they couldn't fit everything on one machine, so they split it up into mini machines, and then they enabled this. Sorry, I have to cough. I'm quite sick, unfortunately. So they enabled this pipeline parallelism where they run the inference through the model inferencing with micro batching with many different machines concurrently and all of the processing stages. And I kind of talked about in the previous 2 episodes ago was where they were running like mini tasks, like mini tasks on all these different servers per se, like these GPUs. And then they are, how do I say? They are checkpointing the model. So they're saving the model at X, they're saving the model at Y, and they're saving the parameters and the data that's fed through at many different points, just in case things blow up. And if it blows up, it isn't as big of a deal. And another thing is when you're doing these micro batching and you're having this pipeline parallelism, you're not putting all your eggs in one basket. Like in that analogy of lawn mowing, if you only had one person mowing that lawn for that workload, and that workload breaks or that lawnmower breaks or something happens with the code, there's a bug, that whole thing is blown up. So you have to fix the lawnmower, you got to fix the yard, whatever. So the whole thing is a wash. But if you have it split into many different pieces, in this case, 2 lawnmowers, the lawnmower could get some work done and then breaks. The second lawnmower could pick up the workload. And so it allows it allows better throughput latency latencycy is but it has some trade-offs, like the actual latency of the responses is longer, but overall pretty decent. And the solution they came up with was keeping things simple. Like a lot of times in this paper, they talk about just keeping things simple. Like life's complicated enough, just keep it simple and find a solution and don't overcomplicate things. And this goes to the next point of what they did. They researched the FP, so floating point of the model. So you can have the model be in different floating points. So a floating point is, I would think about it in a simple manner, is the precision of the binary representation of the data, right? So floating point 64 would have 1 bit, positive and negative, so it has a sign, and then it has 11 bits representing the exponent, a base of 2, and then it has 52 bits representing just different stuff after the decimal. And okay, so 64 is more precise. It's referenced as double precision. 8 is less than 64, and so it goes 8, 16, 32, 64. Okay. So what does that mean? 64 from 8. So 64 is more data. So it's basically it's more precise. It's more precise data. But the trade-off of that is it's more data, right? So they're already processing trillions of tokens. And they also are running into throughput issues so that's why they found a solution with parallelism, and then they're looking for another way to increase throughput. And so they did a study, and it's kind of a question that was posed by many researchers, like, hey, does it matter? How much does it matter if you reduce your model to floating point 8 or 32 or 64? Like how much of a difference, or 16, how much of a difference really is it? So that they did a study in this paper, and they basically their results were that, hey, it's not really that big of a difference. Like there is a difference for sure, but it's not a overly material difference between like a 8 and a 16 from a 64. It's better. The 64 is better. But what is important is, okay, if you were looking to download this model and you only had enough space to do, say, the 8 billion at 64 floating point, or the quantized model at, it's a 408 billion at 8 floating point 8, it's better to do the model regardless of what floating point it's at, the bigger model, the one that has more parameters. Because even if the processing of the model has less precise data, they still have these floating point weights that are included that kind of can upscale the floating points, and then obviously the model is more advanced at that point with having more parameters. Okay, and so what they got from that was, hey, it's not that big of a deal. That was the first part. B, they had throughput efficiency in the decoding stage by 50%. So low precision inferences make large language models more accessible and practical for the real world. And they said, like, hey, like it's not that big of a deal. It is non-negligible for a number of workflows, and it can lead to less errors, and there's overall, I mean, not less errors, but it leads to the ability to run larger models on less resources. There is some issues with like certain data types, like dates sometimes have issues getting processed by such a low floating point model. But other than that, you're good to go. I mean, there are some caveats. It's not perfect, but the gist of it is you do have the ability to run these bigger models at lower floating points. And if you have the choice to run at a lower floating point with a bigger model or a higher floating point with a smaller model, pick the higher parameter model, lower floating point. Man. Okay. So this part of the paper I found super interesting was the video experiments and their audio experiments. And what I did find interesting is that they really broke down the data, and they trained on like ASMR data, which I thought was quite interesting for audio, and for video, which we'll talk about right now. They just used a whole bunch of different types of data. They used it in a text prompt format. So they would have a text pair is what it's called. They have an image and then they have the text paired with it. And so, it would be like, all right, a dog jumping for a Frisbee. And then it would have an image of a dog jumping with a Frisbee. Or it would be like a person putting on a hat. And it'd be like a person putting on a hat. And so it's kind of like the alt text of an image, basically. And so what they did was they ran it through their proprietary state-of-the-art image classifier. And then they had some they used the image classifier to describe the image in that category. And then they ran it through and trained the data, which with the encoder. And so they have an encoder, they have a processor, and then they have an output, right? But the data was trained on both video and image data. Majority of the video data, which I thought was interesting, was lower than 1 minute. So it said, let me see it. The average duration was 21 seconds. The median was 16 seconds. And with over 99% of videos being under 1 minute. And they had a varying degree of pixels. It went down to 320 up to 4K. But majority of the videos were around 720. And they had varying aspect ratios between 1 to 2, 2 to 1, and 1 to 1. The median was the 1 to 1. Very interesting that they're training majority of the model on videos under a minute. For me, that tells me, and it's kind of a shot in the dark here, but it seems like they're preparing for a change to Instagram Reels. So Instagram Reels are all under a minute. You can't post a reel, or I think they recently changed it, but majority of the time the reels are under a minute. And I think you could post now a minute 30 now, the recent update that they did. So I stand corrected. You can't post reels more than a minute, but majority of reels are 1 minute. And then you can post over a minute. I think up to a minute 30, if I remember correctly. Look that up. Let's look that up. How long can a be? What does it say? Okay, so they say 90 seconds. Okay. I was like really hoping that it was going to be a minute and a half, and hopefully not something like 15 minutes, because I only do these one take, so it'll look like an idiot. So I'm glad that Instagram stayed true to their word. True to my word, actually. Okay, so they trained on videos less than a minute, majority of their videos. And so I assume that majority of their videos are from Facebook and Instagram. Obviously not WhatsApp, because they don't have that data. But that's where I assume majority of the videos are coming from. I don't know if they'd have enough. And the videos that they chose to supplement with were probably like TikTok videos or YouTube shorts. Because there's a lot of videos out there. But they intentionally made all their videos under a minute for their data set. So I just wonder what they're planning on doing with it. I know that you can ask Meta to search for Reels, Meta Reels on meta.ai. You can ask Meta to find reels of places you want to go to explore, or find products, or find, shopping ideas, or just different things that you can, instead of having prompts tell you, hey, like I have this idea and, can you tell me how to do it? You could also ask it like, hey, can you find videos, like actual reels of people doing these things so I could see how to do it? And they'd be like, yeah, sure. And it'll pull up a whole bunch of videos. I think it was like a carousel of like 6 reels, and then you could ask for more. But I think after you ask for more twice, it makes you make another prompt asking for more. So you could ask for more, click show more, and then it's like, oh, I won't show you anymore. And then you just say, hey, I want to view more reels of this topic, and then it'll do it for you again. But yeah, so they have the encoder, they've got the image adapter, and they've got the video adapter, and then they kind of, let everything flow. But you got to think about it. So they've got to encode the image. They've got to basically encoding. You got to encode the image and like turn it into like, how do I say? They've got to turn the image into easiest ways, like these tokens, which are a way for the model to understand mathematically what's going on. And so they encode the image in like the pixels and stuff. And then they run it through, right? They run it through, and then they run it through the LLM, which is like, they call it in the research model, they call it the language backbone. And so the language backbone would process what the image encoder, or not the encoder, but the adapter gave to the LLM. One issue that they had was, okay, it was quite time consuming for the model to process the image encoder, and not the image encoder, but images and videos with this architecture. So they changed it to address issues. So one issue they had was like the model scaling. So you could prompt like, all right, so a text prompt has on average, they said like 100, 192 tokens, 200 tokens. They said on average, an image had about 2,000 tokens. And so what the issue they had was, okay, like to process one image or to process one token or one text prompt, like there's such a large difference in data associated with an image than there is text. So what was happening was like the cross attention layers, which is like I discussed it 2 papers ago, what was basically like what the model focuses on would be the image, but then it was kind of not paying attention to the text. And so what they did was they added sequence parallelization into the image encoder so that I would say that each GPU processes the same amount of tokens. So what they had, back to our lawn mowing problem, is when an image is sent and when a text is sent. So when I previously said that an image is about 2,300 tokens, right, on average, is what Meta said from their research and their data set. So if we had this lawn thing, we had one big lawn, like massive lawn, and then we had, I don't know, some townhome lawn that, you just wanted you to mow the front or something like that. And so that wasn't that much work. What was happening was we were only sending one lawnmower to mow the big lawn and then one lawnmower to mow the small lawn. When really the small lawn could be done with clippers, like some like hand clippers, like some big ones, I don't know. And then the big lawn could be done by 3 different lawn mowing people. So we could free up resources to work on, not really free up, like I would split the workload of the available resources so one resource isn't tied up for a long time. So what they did was they sped up with that sequence parallelization, sped up the process of encoding the image, which is like the most like computational piece of it. And then they were able to move past to the next part of the architecture where they attach on to the large language model. If that makes sense, I'm not sure. I thought that was pretty interesting. I don't know if I'm explaining it in a very simple way, but basically, instead of putting all the work onto one person, they split the work amongst other people. And in this case, GPUs. The GPUs split the work evenly. Hopefully, they get done at the same time, and it's overall faster. I guess that makes sense. I don't know. It's just me here, so sometimes it's difficult to know. Okay, so voice experiments. And so they did some voice experiments, which I thought were pretty cool. One of the things that I thought were most interesting, and I mentioned it earlier, was the ASMR training data. They said that they had 230,000 hours of manually transcribed speech recording that span across 34 language of ASMR data. And then they had some AST data, 90K hours. So they've got quite a bit of audio data. I'm not sure where they get all of that from. Maybe they just get it from their Facebook offering with the typically longer videos. I'm not sure, but I thought it was interesting that they use ASMR. So when I think of ASMR, and I might be thinking about it wrong, and you might be like, oh, like you don't even know what you're talking about. I think of like ASMR videos where like they're eating or like they're doing something weird, like they're, I don't know, sipping tea or they're opening a box or something like that. ASMR. Oh, that's a face slap moment. That's how you know I'm sick. So it's ASR, not ASMR. So ASR versus, oh my gosh. Oh my gosh, that's crazy. Meaning ASR versus ASMR. What is audio? I'm having a hard time getting an answer. Oh, automatic speech recognition. Okay, so it's like text that was turned into audio. Or audio, I guess speech to text. So it wasn't actually, I'm kind of confused now. Okay, so let's break this down. So they use the ASMR data, which is voices or voice turned into text. So that's why they have so much transcription. There's so much transcription data of the actual voice data because they were able to map up the voice with the text. But it makes me question the voice. Like, is it just a robot that does the voice for a long time? And then I don't know. I'm not sure. I'm all jacked up on this. Sorry. I read that. I read that originally as ASMR, and I wrote that in my notes as ASMR. I thought I was like so weird that they're using ASMR data. That makes so much more sense that they're not. But ASMR is the purpose of converting audio data like voice calls, voice searches on your phone and podcasts into a format computers can understand, often readable text. So it's basically voice data encoded into automatic speech recognition or voice recognition. So it has this training data of voice data that is transcribed, but they're saying manually transcribed. And then they have additional training data with 90 hours of data. So they are cooking with all this voice data. I'm not sure where they got it all from. But basically, they said that the model is multilingual. It can understand. It has speech recognition for multiple languages. It has translation, and so they're saying that it has a good potential to break down language barriers among people communicating across cultures, which I think is interesting. And basically something similar results with their video and audio stuff, not audio, video and images, video and image data, they had similar feelings like, hey, like it's pretty good. It has a good ability to like understand and provide, this reasonable feedback with the images and videos that you provide. One of the issues with the image and video piece and research experiments and the speech experiments was it performed badly, or I guess poorly, not badly, it performed poorly against Meta, not Meta. I'm talking about Meta. Meta performed poorly against Google and OpenAI with their safety. So it was easier to manipulate the model to get it to do things it shouldn't be doing, like jailbreak the model with image and video and audio. So there are still evaluating how they think the best approach should be. And I think that's one of the reasons why it hasn't been released yet. And it also might be released in conjunction with a new product release. Like they might launch a new Meta glasses partnered with Ray-Bans. And they're like, oh, like now you can have video and voice recognition and all this speech stuff, and it's processed at super fast speeds, low latency, and it's almost like Gemini Live or ChatGPT Live, but in your glasses, which I think would be pretty cool, and I would definitely check out. Okay, so transitioning to like the conclusion, how things should be, right? And so their real suggestion with this approach in the model and the things that they learned was, okay, to develop a high quality foundational model, there's still a lot of discovery that needs to be done. Like this isn't a fully baked sector. Like there are a lot of practices or said so practices that might not necessarily be true. So what they did is they did a lot of discovery and experimentation. But while they were doing that, they focused on high quality data. They focused on scaling their processes and keeping it simple. That's it. That's really the feedback. So when you're doing something complicated in your life and you're trying to have a high quality, effort or input of the situation, and you want to scale that to your team or other people in your life or just general situations or your business, keep it simple. And we hear that all the time, but for something so complicated, the best approach is normally the one that is easy to implement and yields. It might not yield the best outcome, but for outcome to experimentation to implementation to production, that choice is probably the best one. And what Meta did is they laid it all out there like, hey, does the quantization of models matter that much for quality of your model? No, it doesn't. And so they're just kind of breaking through each of these barriers like, okay, does this actually matter? Or is this approach better than that approach? And they did it in a scientific manner at a small scale. And then they did their analysis and like, hey, like the simple approach works. Like it works better than the other one. Let's just do the simple one. And so for this complex problem, they're just chewing away at it little by little with simplicity. Simplicity is the solvent for complexity. Okay. Well, that was the podcast, and I hope that you enjoyed it and you learned some. I definitely learned a lot. I enjoyed reading the paper and creating this content for everyone. If you like the video, like or subscribe, either or give a follow depending on what platform you're on. Really appreciate it. And of course, I'll see you next week. And wherever you are in this world, either it be a good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. I hope you have a great day and talk to you soon. Bye.